Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roberto. You know that Roberto wrote a book about Laravel. Wrote, like, who wrote book? Who write books today? Okay. No, thank you, everyone. I'm very proud. I'm very proud to be here. That they invited me as a keynoter at the PHP Day. PHP Day, most important PHP conference in Italy. You know that when I started at university like 20 years ago, and I started programming, you know, my first programming language was Java, of course, was Java. But then I started working, and so I graduated, I started working as a freelance. I had to just pick a language. I wanted an open source language, good community. I wanted also a free CMS, of course, for building products for my customers. And so, of course, I chose Python. Like, yeah. But jokes aside, I started with PHP 4, I think, back at the university, then 5. My first job as a computer scientist was with Drupal, like 20 years ago, another time. But so I moved for this. Today, I want to talk about things that we take for granted. Like, there are many things that we take for granted. Like, there are things that we use, names, terms that we use, but that we don't really question, right? Like, we use them, we don't question their meaning, their origins, why they chose a specific name, what are their deep meanings. Like, you know that, for example, in MySQL, you know that in MySQL, it's not MySQL, it's because of a child, because was the daughter of Montevidenius. So MySQL is named after a child. In fact, when he then forked MySQL with MariaDB, so Maria is his other daughter. Another fun fact, you know that the fox in Firefox is not actually a fox? You know that? It's a panda, yeah, because Firefox is the nickname for the red panda. I know that the logo is misleading, but it's actually a red panda. There are many fun facts, like Debian, for example, Deborah and Ian, or the PageRank algorithm. It's not for the web page, but it's for Larry Page, PageRank. So I think even for open source is that we use the name, the term. We don't really question the origins. And we use it constantly. But do we know what it really means? Let me tell you a story. Probably many of you here already know the origins of open source and the name, but I think still it's interesting. And plus it's my talk, so I tell you what I want. So Christine Peterson. Christine Peterson is a forecaster, people that predicts the future. She founded the Foresight Institute. She was interested in nanotechnology. And the Institute promotes their research and their benefits. 2 facts about Christine Peterson. She graduated in chemistry. And when she will die, her body will be cryopreserved because she signed for that process. I don't know. I think it's interesting. In 1997, at the Foresight Institute, they were discussing cybersecurity. And they found that free software was a promising approach for improving the security of software. But then they started questioning the term, because newcomers always thought that free software was referring to the price. Then some old-birded computer scientists must just come up and say, free as in freedom, not as in free beer. But still, they decided that we needed a better term, a clearer term. In February 1998, Netscape had their plans to release the software as free software, with a free software license. Eric Raymond was working with them, was supporting them, And he was using the Foresight Institute as a base of operations. So there were many meetings at the time, each week. And they discussed the term. Actually, someone proposed the sourceware. Someone cooperatively developed. And you know, Brian Behlendorf, probably know him. It's one of the creators of Apache, the Apache Foundation. I think it's even in Mozilla now. She used the source code available, which I think is a bit of an ironic, because today source available is not open source. But at the time, it was like another term for the same concept. Christine Peterson, at some point, came up with the term open source. And others in the room were convinced enough. They eventually started using it in conversations. And just like that, organically, the terms stayed. When the topic was tackled explicitly, the consensus was already there. So they started using it. Honestly, they weren't really interested in the name, more on the concept around it. But immediately after agreeing on the term, Bruce's parents started opensource.org and the open source initiative with Eric Raymond, the open source initiative for advocating and preserving the term and the licenses and everything. And also, Tim O'Reilly was involved, and he loved the term. He started using the term in his projects. And then Netscape used the open source when they released the browser as open source. It's free. But now you may wonder, what was the definition of open source at the time? On April 7, 1998, Tim O'Reilly held a meeting of key leaders in the field and announced in advance was the Freeware Summit. But by April 14, it was referred to as the first open source summit. So the term spread very quickly. Companies started using it. Every week, a new company announced plans to participate. This is from the blog post, a blog post on the Christine Peterson's blog. OSI, the Open Source Initiative, their first task was to provide a definition for the term. And since Bruce's parents worked on the Debian free software guidelines, they just took them. They refined it a bit, they removed Debian references, and that was basically the definition that we still use. Today, of course, one of the main goals of the Open Source Initiative is to maintain the open source definition. They also they published an open source AI definition. There are some controversies around that. We won't talk about it. But somehow, I like the simplicity of this definition. This was from the press release of the the Open Source Summit. Open source software, or sourceware, was defined as software whose source code is available, so that users can customize or extend it. That's in contrast to software whose source code is not available. So you may think that open source is simple, that defining something as open source is simple, right? But is it? Let me play a game with you, also to cheer you up, because we are just getting started. I feel that you are a bit sleepy. Now, cheer you up. I will now show you the logo of a software, and you will raise your hand if you think that software is open source. Okay? Let's start with something simple to warm up. So Linux, the kernel, who thinks is open source? Okay, that's easy. Linux is open source, GPL v2. The Windows kernel, who thinks is open source? Yeah, that's easy too. It's not open source, definitely. Microsoft EULA, EULA, is like an agreement with the user. Some partners can look at the kernel's code, but definitely it's not open source. The macOS kernel, who thinks is open source? macOS kernel, the kernel of the macOS operating system. Who thinks is open source? A few think open source. It actually is open source because the core of macOS is Darwin. Darwin is a Unix-like operating system. It has a kernel which is X and U, and it includes elements from FreeBSD, and this kernel was released by Apple under this license, the Apple Public Source License, which is an open source license. Is actually, what? Yeah, probably that's a history, but now, today, the kernel of the macOS system, Darwin, is open source. Trust me. We can discuss it later. Okay. Now, PHP. Who thinks PHP is open source? Some of you think that PHP is not open source because you're shy? Or, okay. Actually, it's open source, but it's a bit weird because PHP uses the PHP license, which is a license that's very specific to PHP. Also, it has some limitations, like you can fork PHP, you can use it for everything, but you cannot use the PHP name. And actually, to use the PHP name, you have to obtain a permission from the PHP group, which doesn't exist anymore. So it's weird because the history of the license is interesting. PHP started with a GPL license, then they adopted a dual licensing approach. They were GPL and PHP license, but the two were not compatible, so it was a mess. Then they decided to just use PHP license, but they submitted PHP license for approval to OSI 3 years later. So there's a time frame in which open source is now open source technically in history. It's interesting. Now, I found out just yesterday, talking with Roman, that they are discussing the licensing issue. I think it's pretty interesting. MongoDB. Who thinks MongoDB is open source? Some of you think MongoDB is open source? MongoDB is not open source. MongoDB actually was open source. Technically, they were AGPL, but they introduced the SSPL, the server-side public license, which is not considered an open source license. Redis, who thinks Redis is open source? Who thinks Redis is open source today? I'm sorry, Redis is not open source. Redis is, they changed the license, right? Now they are GPL, AGPL again. They switched, and they switched back. So they were no open source. Now they are open source again, technically. Okay. Okay, .NET. Who thinks .NET is open source? You have to be more informed. .NET is MIT, like the most permissive open source license in history. .NET was not open source back in the days, and they created .NET Framework, that not .NET Core. .NET Framework was not open source. .NET Core was open source, but then they merged the two, and now today .NET is open source. It's MIT. Last one, Sentry. Who thinks Sentry is open source? Some of you think that Sentry is open source. It's actually funny. The functional source license, but if you read the license, on the bottom, the footer is, I'm reading, we hereby irrevocably grant you an additional license to use the software under the Apache license that is effective on the 2nd anniversary of the date we make the software available. So 2 years after a version is published, that version of the software is Apache, so it's open source. So it's a Apache future license. It's a dual licensing, but with a time frame. So it's an interesting approach. Now, all this just to say that things are not simple. In fact, we were talking about MongoDB and Redis before. It all comes down to a challenge, to the fight between the AGPL and SSPL. Many people were angry at Redis when they changed, or at MongoDB. People got crazy because they changed the license, or where MongoDB changed the license, when Elasticsearch changed the license. Because they adopted the SSPL, which is not open source. Let me show you a diff. So on the right, you have the AGPL, and on the left, you have the SSPL, right? The differences between these two licenses are just a couple of differences. The MongoDB, when they created the SSPL, they removed the preamble. The preamble is significant, but it's just the preamble, it's not terms and conditions. The preamble states that the software is copyleft, and blah, blah, blah. But it's more a philosophical approach to using the software. Almost everything else, like this point is just referring to a section 13, but it's just the same paragraph, just pointing to section 13. Everything else is exactly the same, except for section 13, which is actually the only significant difference between the two licenses, because if you use the SSPL, like MongoDB, if you sell MongoDB as a service, then you are forced to release the service with SSPL and all the other software that you use to make it work. That's all the infrastructure. You're forced to release everything because the user must be able to reproduce the entire stack under the SSPL. And of course, this is not okay for cloud vendors. And the open source initiative decided that this is not compatible with the open source principles because it prevents a specific use. Also, the conclusions are the same. So you see that there are many different shades of open source. Software, licenses, scenarios. So you may think that, or we may agree now that open source is a spectrum, right? There are many different things in open source, but actually, officially, like this is one blog post from the open source initiative 1 month ago, and you can scan the QR code if you want to read the whole post, but they state that openness is binary, because openness is like freedom. So you either have it or you don't. And I think this is a very problematic definition, because we just saw that we have many shades of open source. And also, freedom is not a binary concept. Like philosophers wrote books about freedom. Freedom is a complex topic. Like you have to talk about your context. You have to talk about, ethics, moral, the people around you, society. It's not that, like they say, if you are in a prison, you're not free. If you're outside of a prison, you're free. That's not how it works. Like, and it's the same in open source. I think it's not that you have a software that you can consider open source or not. In fact, the licenses that they approved are dozens of licenses, right? And there are differences between licenses. If openness was a binary concept, then they would have just one license, open source, not open source. But there are many. And many of them are not compatible. And you will find, and you will work with many companies that accept a subset of these licenses and not all of them. Let me drink and look at this beautiful picture. I think we as software engineers should look at the principles, the way we approach software engineering. It's like a philosophy. We should remember why we are here today. We studied these things, we studied code, we learned, we participated in communities. These are the GNU principles. You can't find these principles in any other industry. We are lucky. And we owe this to the people who pushed for a broad adoption of this philosophy. And they were less interested in a business model, but more in a way of thinking about computer science, more like a science thing than a business thing. And today, I see that there are many people, again, that get angry when a software company changes the license, probably without even reading the license or understanding the business case behind it. I think business should be separated from the discussion. Business is a complex matter. We are computer scientists. I think we must look at these principles. If these principles are shared, even by the company, the license is a business thing. And of course, I know that these principles were conceived in a world that was different than what we have today. But I think these principles can stay. It's the open source definition that can evolve. Look at how the corporate world reacted to open source 25 years ago. This is a notorious example, right? But it was a common sentiment in the market. We all remember that free software was born against this, to fight this. And again, it's because we wanted freedom. We wanted to be computer scientists interested in creating things, not in the business side. And 20 years later, the situation is totally subverted. This is from the Octoverse 2022, because I love these numbers, but any Octoverse, any open source surveys, now after this one, they are just bigger, right? The corporate world have completely embraced the open source. We must be proud of our achievements because we fueled the revolution and we shaped the industry. So now, the corporate world, they were the enemy back then, but now they are defeated and today they build differently. They start from open source, or they don't start at all. There are different approaches even. I'm working at Storyblok. Storyblok is a software as a service, headless CMS. The product is not open source, the core product. But I'm proud that the company actively supports open source. Around the product, we build many things, SDKs, libraries, and we release them, and we maintain them, and we have a conversation with the people, with the community. We want to contribute. We are at conferences. We sponsor conferences. We sponsor open source projects, and we are actively involved in many of them, sponsoring, financially supporting them, and contributing. This is a way for a company to adopt the principle, to contribute, to be part of a movement, even if the core product is not open source. And I'm still proud of it. Of course, there are still many issues. Open source is not perfect. We still must be vigilant. We must still fight to preserve what we achieved, right? Of course, there are many problems. Intellectual properties, security, ownership, legal issues, economic sustainability, probably one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest challenge. So we should not just sit and wait for a solution that magically comes from the open source initiative in I don't know, in the form of a new license. That's not happening. We are a community. We can think of a solution together. And I'm not here to give you a solution, but Bruce Spence was one of the founders of the movement and the open source initiative. And today, he's starting something new. He's starting to give some answers. He says that many businesses are extracting wealth from open source. They are not contributing back. Says the open source has not really reached the common person. So issues with open source, and open source can address the legal problems. Will you be able to address the legal part of the compliance with the license of your source code. Like if you release a software with a license and a company abuses your software, will you then sue the company? Do you have the legal knowledge and the financial support to sue them? It's a complex thing. So this is probably not the definitive answer, but it's a possible solution. It's a proposal. It's called post-open. And again, you can find the link here. It's a new licensing model, which is designed to address some of these concerns. The key features are dual licensing, so you can license the product with a post-open license and an open source license. Fair compensation, where the project is that big, large companies earning more than $5 million per year, they just give something back to the project, the community, and that earnings are distributed, they are pooled and distributing among open source developers and contributors based on the usage. So like for fair pay for work done. For compliance, simplified compliance. So like companies can report their usage annually and pay a small percentage of their fees, of their revenues, and discover all the post-open software. And then security, just trusting developers, verifying developers, cryptographically signing packages, software. We all know that the supply chain is a weak spot. So using best practices and signing tools to enhance the security of the supply chain. And the support, unified support for companies, like not one developer giving support to one software, but many developers gathering together to trying to support all, or a pool of softwares, like unifying all the support. So this is trying to create a sustainable ecosystem and ensuring that everyone is fairly compensated. Again, this is, of course, probably not the answer. But it's a proposal, and I think we should try to discuss proposals together, because I think that open source started as a revolution, but now it can just evolve into what, I don't know, but probably something new and something better. Thank you. Again, you can find me online. I have some YouTube channels. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Mastodon. You can't probably read these because I messed up with the colors, but if you want to listen to me talking in Italian, I have a podcast. It's called Buongiorno da Edo. You can find this on Spotify and whatever. But also I have a YouTube channel, and I try to speak this Italian English. Thank you again.